that something else is going to happen in order for us to come to an understanding of what really happens in this world. When I was a senior in college, I had what some people would consider to be a very bad day. I had a physics exam for 2 hours back to back with a philosophy exam for 2 hours. And the night before, I was studying with a friend named Julia. And we were going through our notes for this philosophy exam, and we came across 2 words that the professor had made up and hadn't published yet. There were 2 terms, 2 ideas, and the problem was that she had them written down one word with a different definition than I did. So we had the same 2 words and the same 2 definitions, but I had them matched differently. And there was no way that we could actually look this up to figure out who was right because it hadn't been published yet. So she said, I'll go into his office, talk to him in the morning, and maybe I'll get to see you before the exam. And I said, I'm going to assume that I'm right unless I hear otherwise from you. And she said, I said, okay. So I go to take my physics exam, run across campus, come into the lecture hall just as the tests are being passed out, and she's in the middle and the professor's on the end and the papers are coming across, and I slide into my seat and she looks over at me and she says, Nathan, you're wrong. That's all she says. So I sit down, the professor explains the exam, I flip it over, 2 essay questions for the final exam. First question, explain such and such theory. That was the one that I had said, I'm going to assume I'm right unless I hear from you. Now, I have some serious thinking to do here, right? Because either I trust Julia, or there's going to be a double thump as I go into the bus in this class. The final exam is hinged off of her honesty on this. When we don't know how to decide, oftentimes we need some external revelation. Information has to come from somewhere else. And in this situation, I have to ask myself, what is the character and the nature of the person who's revealing truth to me right now? Is Julia the type of person that would help me or total me in this class? And I decided to trust her, and it was a good thing that I did, and it all worked out well. But in that same vein, when we need information from the outside, we have to question the character and the nature of the person who is making truth claims and revealing truth to us. And in Christianity, we do believe in a system that is physical, but we believe that that physical system was made by that which is spiritual, that which transcends it, that was willing to come into it and reveal itself to us in the person of Jesus Christ. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, was he crazy? Or can I trust, based off of the character and the nature of who this revealer is, can I take them seriously about the additional information that they bring to us about how the world operates? Jesus doesn't come into the world to contradict the physical world. If anything, he affirms it. He's the one who made it, said that it was good. But he does peel off the lid of the clock a little bit and want to show us the gears behind it and say perhaps there's a little bit more going on here that meets the eye. And so it's not a contradiction of our physical desire to physically explore the world, but it's a taunt to cast our vision a little bit higher and say, what if it's this and a little bit more? And so the question really isn't whether or not science has proven Christianity to be wrong, it's whether or not science has proven Christianity to be unnecessary. And that might be the question that's in your heart tonight is, are there categories of truth that I'm seeking that are beyond what can be scientifically answered? And if so, does Christianity match with that? And I'm saying yes to that. And I'm coming down the home stretch here, and just to say, as I piece this all together, we think about, are there categories of questions that we desire answers to that don't have a physical meaning to them? Part of where I came out as an undergraduate student. And this came from sitting in modern physics classes and saying, you know what? The professor would get up and say, this is how we understand quantum mechanics, but in 10 years somebody can come in and rewrite the whole way that we understand this. So get to work. And so there's this incredible beauty and delight at the way in which we can model reality, but also this fun kind of like we're on the edge of something here, and we're not going to say this is absolutely true because we want to keep pushing deeper into this. So absolute truth wasn't found in the mathematics of it. It was a model of reality, not a law of reality. And then on the philosophy side, we were great at answering questions that were hypothetical that we made up. But when we started trying to map those onto our actual experiences, it got difficult. And so in physics and philosophy, I sensed the desire that we had to know something, but I wasn't sure what it was, and knew that both of these categories didn't have it. And so what do? You stand on the corner and you hypothesize as you watch humanity, and you think about your own life and say, what is it that we are seeking as people? And what we're seeking as humans, and you know this from music and movies and your own heart, is relationship, oftentimes. And you have friends that have gone through all sorts of train wrecks of relationships, things that we put our hope in that have ultimately let us down. And I started thinking, it almost seems like we were designed to be in relationship with something that was perfect that wouldn't let us down in relationship. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And so this is where it starts coming together in my mind as I piece these things together, that there's a beautiful confluence between a God who loves and made the world, but also loves and made me and wants me to know and be in relationship with him. And there's no sense in which that type of knowing the baker and eating the cake is a problem for me. Those two go together beautifully. And that's some of the way in which I think about this relationship between faith and science. You can have real faith in science. I had a professor whose hope for the future was that they would be able to develop their technology in brain transplants before he died. That was his faith, his hope, his confidence for the future was based off of that scientific technology. And that's one way to live your life. But the science of faith embraces that, but also says, if we look back on the history of humanity and of our lives, do we have any other pointers or indicators to think that there is something that transcends this all, that is willing to come and be a part of it, and live consistently and make promises that are good to us for the good of humanity, that teach us not only to worship something beyond ourselves, but to serve each other and do good to our neighbors as well. And I see that woven together beautifully in the person of Christ. I'm going to stop talking now. I've thrown a lot out there, and I'm sure that you have further thoughts, suggestions, and questions and comments that you would like to bring back this way. So our moderator is going to come back up, give a few instructions. Daniel's going to come up. We're going to move the chairs over, and then you can come to the microphone, and he'll explain all of that. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you. All right, here's how this is going to work. We want the conversation to continue, but that depends on you guys asking some good questions. So there's two ways you can ask questions. Allie, there's a slide that has some of that information on here specifically for it. There's two ways you can ask questions. One, and the one we'll give priority to, there's a microphone right here. And so what we would encourage you to do is come take a stand. You can form a line. So if there's 3 people there and you think of a question, go be the 4th person in line. You can wait until your spot comes up and ask your questions away. We will give priority to that. So if all we get to is the live questions, great. And in fact, I'm hoping that we get all our live questions. The other way you can ask your questions, if you email your question, if you have your phone on you and you email to thinksouthloop@gmail.com, I will be moderating those emails as they come in up here. And if there's a lull in the live questions, I will jump ahead to the email-in questions. All right. So do not hesitate. You can begin to form at the microphone. I highly encourage you to ask good questions. No question is a dumb question. I want to remind us of that. If you have a question, it's very likely that the majority of the folks in this room, including myself, have that question, and would love to hear 2 people that are way smarter than me answer that question. Sound good? All right. So please come ahead. Why don't I kick us off this way, and then I'm going to take my seat. And I'm just going to pose the first question. Again, you guys can come and start submitting your questions whenever you want. But just to kick us off, as the first question, as science continues to make more and more discoveries, exposing the anatomy of how our world works, what do you think is the future of this question?
If you guys don't mind, I'm going to untangle this. Seems a little less formal that way. So 3 things popped in my mind when you asked that question about the future of this question. And one of those that I found to be funny in speaking to students at MIT, I was in Boston for 3 years, and so most of my science conversations, I initially thought I was going to have this conversation a lot at MIT, but the Christian students there said, oh, you know, actually we've resolved all of this. This isn't really a big question that we have. This is more of the type of question that people that aren't scientists ask as sort of a red herring on the topic of science and religion. So I thought that was fascinating that they sort of saw that it was something that was falling by the wayside in the trajectory of the way in which these 2 things relate. The other one is that we talk about as science develops and knows more and more, will this the need for this question go away? And this is sort of what we might call an argument called the God of the gaps. That we would say, well, we just postulate God in the gaps that we don't understand scientifically, like why is the sky blue? You say God, and then you figure out how it actually works, and then you don't need God anymore. So that's called the God of the gaps. I would say that I'm a Christian not because of the God of the gaps, but because I believe in the God of the given. So it's based off what has been made known to me that I believe that there's a God, not based off of what I don't know that makes me believe that there is a God. And the third one is that I don't know if those of you who are scientifically minded or enjoying science classes or something have older people in your life to talk to, but it is an absolute hoot to talk to somebody who graduated in, say, the 1950s about physics, because so much has changed since that time. And so when I was an undergrad, I would call my grandfather up and be like, hey, we'd start chatting. He'd be like, oh, what's the latest model of the atom? We're doing differential equations for probability densities, electron clouds, and p orbitals and whatnot. And he's like, we didn't even have p orbitals, when I was a student. And so we just laughed about how much had changed in physics in those 60 years. But then he would say, what are you reading in your philosophy classes? And I would start rattling stuff. I was like, yeah, we read that, yeah, we read that, yeah, we read that. And so there's this fascinating way where scientifically we're progressing rapidly in our knowledge and understanding, but we're still asking the same types of questions that Aristotle was asking 2,000 years ago. And so the fundamental questions of the human heart go to the side of our scientific progress, if that makes sense. So I think the question will always be there. I think the church has, in some ways, not helped itself in a way that's pulled back from engaging this conversation sometimes. So I'm optimistic that the question will continue in some ways, but that it will be articulated in a way that it maybe isn't the primary question that it is sometimes today. All right, and this will be like tag team, so we'll go back and forth here. And if you could give us your name, that would be great.
My name is John Root. So my question has to do with, I guess, how much autonomy, I guess, you really have as you're trying to cooperate with knowing the creator, as you're assessing what's true and what's not. So you talked about how you used the analogy of like wanting to, I want to have my cake and know the baker, or like in your example with your friend Julia. Yeah. You were incorporating knowing her into the process of assessing this, and so it seems to me like there's two ways in which you can do something like that. I mean, there's what I'm familiar with was kind of the presuppositionalist way, where you're saying, I'm going to presuppose from the beginning that God exists, and then I'm going to sort of say that that's like a valid kind of a presupposition I should be able to have, and I continue to build upon that. And then there's kind of like a coherentist way to do that, where you say, well, I see that all I can really do is use my own reasoning at first, but I see that there's a lot of data, and there's like a few different models that fit with this data, and I think that the model that fits the best is the one where like God is involved. And so I'm trying to understand like which one of those, if you're operating in one of those two ways, and if you think that from the get-go we can start like reasoning with God. I don't know if that makes sense, but sure. Okay.
John, yeah, that's a great question. Man, the autonomy and that question of freedom and whatnot, and how do we come to conclusions, it's a massive topic, and very normal to be struggling with and to be thinking about. So, first of all, I just want to apologize for wearing a jacket. I don't know if it's a weird thing, but I think I might be the token Texan here. It's really cold. So, just wanted to say that. It's freezing even here for me. I hail from Texas, but and everybody was freaking out that it was 68 degrees this week. So, anyways, it's good to be here. So that question of autonomy and coming to decisions and reality. I don't know if this helps at all, but as you were talking, I was thinking of this book that I'm remembering in my mind, and I might butcher it, but I think it's called The Diary of Antoine or Quentin. If anybody's ever heard of that, Antoine or Quentin. It's in the book. There's a really interesting scene in the book where this guy, Antoine, he's going out in the countryside, and he's looking at a tree, a chestnut tree, and all of a sudden he has this thought. In the thought, what he says in the book is that at one moment I found the key to existence. And you're thinking, okay, well, what could it be? Looking at a chestnut tree. And what he goes on to say is that what he realized was, in his mind, there was this desire for harmony, this desire for meaning, for purpose, for value, for love, for justice, all these things. But he realized that there was a world outside of him, outside of his mind, between these 2 years. And that world outside of his mind was a world of meaninglessness. The tree just exists. There's no meaning for the tree to exist, is what he was saying. And it created a dilemma in him. This dilemma that was so strong in him. It's the classic case of the kid saying, why is the sky blue? There's this desire in the mind, this rationale of wanting to know the reasons why we exist. What's the purpose? Why are we here? Those questions of why. I desire for harmony. I desire purpose and value and intimacy and justice and all these kinds of things. But the world out there just seems to be no rhyme, no reason, pitiless indifference. And what's interesting about the book is that it was written in French originally, and when it was translated into English, the first time it was translated into English was in North America, and the title that was given was a one-word title called Nausea by a guy named Jean-Paul Sartre. And the reason why it was called Nausea was because that it created this nausea feeling, that it created in Antoine this emotional, psychological sickness almost, of how could there actually be no meaning, no purpose, no value, no justice outside of just my mind. And we've, famous Bertrand Russell, famous, atheist, mathematician, logician, philosopher of sorts, has the famous quote. One time he was in a debate and somebody asked him, Bertrand, you're a smart man, why does the universe exist? And as an atheist man, he quipped back very quickly, I should say that the universe exists because it exists, and that's it. And everybody in the audience moaned, no, there's got to be more, right? But as we see more and more people who can't posit a transcendence, can't posit a God to give meaning to a human being, they find themselves, and this is what all the great thinkers, the great atheist thinkers perhaps would say. Voltaire has that famous quote that we as humans are tormented atoms in a bed of mud. I mean, it's poetic, but it's also incredibly depressing. But the reality is that I suppose if you start from that baseline understanding of, okay, just like Antoine, you're in that countryside and you have those thoughts, why am I even here? And then you have this dilemma. The question is, do we go on and live in this dilemma? Is that really the point? Is that really maybe what we're supposed to do? Do we go on and live the rest of our life in this dilemma that we have, that there is meaning outside of this world, that there seems to be meaning? Stephen Hawking, famous physicist out of Cambridge, the theory of everything, if you're familiar with his work. He's got tons of lectures on meaning and how to come to decision and rationality and free will and autonomy and whatnot. And I won't go into that logical determinism, but what he essentially says is, just like maybe perhaps the popular cultural narrative today would be that you create meaning. Meaning is something that you create between your two ears. It's in your mind. That's where meaning is ultimately going to be found. And there's lots of problems with that, and they know that. I think those who would hold to that might know that, if we tease it out more. The Christian alternative is that there is meaning that is outside of yourself. This is kind of what Nathan was saying. What would happen if actually meaning wasn't something that you ultimately just created and you manufactured? See, the problem with creating your own meaning is that you ultimately have to create, manufacture, and maintain your created meaning for life. If you succeed, it'll go to your head. If you fail, it'll go to your heart. And there's this reality of how do we understand what it means to be a free person, to have autonomy, to have meaning, to have values as a human. The Christian alternative says, and I'll stop after just this real quickly. But if you're familiar with the word logos, it's a Greek word, L-O-G-O-S. And the Greeks used to argue about this word back and forth. Logos is directly translated as logic, right? But more, perhaps better translation would be something like the reason for existence, the reason why the universe exists, the logic of existence, right? The meaning of life. And as the Greeks were arguing about this back and forth, they posited philosophical ideas, worldviews, tried to get to a conclusion, and they eventually said, there just is no logos. It's just all meaningless, like Antoine, like Sartre, like Camus, like Voltaire, like Russell, Hawkins. And by the time, Jesus showed up on the scene, John the Baptist, you're familiar, he writes a book in the Bible, John, one of the Gospels. And he does this massive mic drop. He shows up on the scene and he pens these words, in the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was God. He was with God, and he dwelt among us. Now you might be wondering, why is that a massive mic drop? Essentially, it's a massive mic drop because what he's saying is the Logos is not going to be found in a philosophical quandary. It's not going to be found in a philosophical thought. This word was so loaded, in other words. And what he says is the Logos is found in a person. And this person is to be known. And this person, furthermore, isn't a dictator. That would be a bad deal. But in fact, it's a person who knows you deeply and loves you to the skies. So what if we found the Logos? What if we found it, in other words? And John shows up on the scene and says, I know the Logos, because he's a person. And we as relational beings are meant to know this relational God and be in a relationship with him. There's much more to be said about that, but maybe that's a starting point. Maybe Nathan has some.
Chat with me afterward. I'm not sure if you're asking a question from a theory of epistemology, how we know what we know, or from a system of theology.
Yeah.
How does that? Do you know?
Epistemology.
Epistemology, yeah. Can I recommend some resources to you for that afterward? I do think we need to come to a place where we have, I think I do both, actually, to be completely honest with you. Presuppositional, that I presuppose that my rationality can get me to where I need to go. And there's some, we'll talk about that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Let John, right?
Yeah.
Come see me. Yes, please.
How you doing?
Fine, thanks. And your name?
Over.
Oh,
Yeah, I was wondering, why do scientists always question Christianity when they have like faith leaders and just lots of churches and people actually believing that there is a God and there's just stuff happening that man can't answer, and the only answer is God. Why do you think scientists always go back to, why Christianity and the body always question it?
Yeah, well, one thing I would say to that is that there are a significant number of scientists that are Christians or are members of other faith communities, a surprisingly high amount. So there's that. There's another sense in which I think part of the, if it seems like there's an abrasiveness from the scientific community toward Christianity, is because Christians started it in some ways, in some senses. In the sense that oftentimes we end up with people that are theologically trained telling scientists what they ought to conclude from their data. And nobody ever likes that if you're speaking out of your field into somebody else's field. So I think the posture by which the church responds to people and their understanding of reality, we need to be careful of that. And so I don't think it's a rational thing or a logical thing as much as it is a tone of the conversation type of thing. And the reason that we can say that we know that it doesn't have to be either or is because there are a lot of Christian scientists. But it's a good question to ask in the sense of why does it seem to be that there's this tension there? And I think people are culpable on both sides as far as the rhetoric that's used or the sense in which people feel demeaned in who they are by the way that other fields critique their work for them.
Both are right. Did you say faith healing? Did you mention the word healing? Did I miss?
Not healing, just...
You mentioned miracles, though, in the church.
Just questions.
Things that
questions that man don't have an answer for, and it's just people just praying and believing that it happens.
Yeah, and so why scientists would perhaps, and Nathan's answer was really helpful as well. The one thing that so I don't come from a Christian background either, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow night, but one of my big objections before I was a Christian was I thought Christianity was just a psychological wish fulfillment. And oftentimes when you look into the church as an outsider, you see a lot of people wanting to believe in God because it makes them feel good. Or miracles happen, or claiming that big things were happening, or these things that no man could explain and whatnot. And they would say things like, well, it's the supernatural. And as a materialist, I thought that was just absurd. Right? And I thought, well, you're just making it up in your mind. It's just wish fulfillment. So oftentimes, perhaps sometimes that's the case, that scientists will look in and say, explain it perhaps through psychology is an avenue.
Yeah, so he's basically just saying they can believe that it's unnecessary because of a commitment to an idea that everything eventually will be able to be explained through science.
Hi.
Hello.
Good evening.
Your
My
name?
name's Hunter.
Hunter. All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what your thoughts are on where original sin fits within the framework of the scientific view of the origin of life and evolution.
Great. All right, you take this one, I'll take Harvard. Can you, let's make sure we understand what you're saying exactly. So you're asking where original sin fits in with evolution, and is there anything else in that question?
No, that's it.
Okay. A couple terms we should define here, right? So the first one being that there are multiple ways that people understand evolution, multiple ways that people understand original sin. One of our colleagues said that as a child he thought that original sin was a sin that you were the first one to ever do. I'm saying this way. That isn't original sin. People who would be on the creationist side, from a Christian background, or a theistic evolutionist side, would say that there was a point in humanity in which we developed a consciousness or the capacity for complex thought and relationship, and that whatever that was in that first being, that constituted the first man. So if we bracket that and say when we get to the first human, what is the proclivity of that type of human? When we talk about sin, we have to ask ourselves, what is sin? And sin, if we use all the resources that we have from sort of a biblical theological understanding of what's revealed in Scripture, sin is the violation of purpose. And so even if you take the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, it says that he looked and saw that the fruit was good, it was pleasing the eye, and she reached out and took it, right? And so looking and seeing and acknowledging something that's pleasing the eye and reaching and taking, those aren't sinful in and of themselves. Those are God-given abilities and actions that we're capable of doing. It was the context in which she expressed that action that made it contrary to the purpose that God had for her. And so the power to sin and the power not to sin aren't necessarily unique powers. If you see me standing outside of Whole Foods with an avocado, you can assume one thing: I paid too much money for an avocado. So the question is, did I buy it or did I steal it? And the same skill that it takes to so there's a number of things you can. So, but what I'm saying is that the ability to pick it up and walk out of the store is the same whether I stole it or paid for it. And so it's the context in which we express the potentials that we have that make it a violation or not. So if you have a God who's orchestrating for a purpose and has a purpose for our action, then sin is going to be the inherent proclivity within the first conscious person, let's call him Adam, Eve, to do other than what God had intended for them to do. So I think you do have some, you asked a huge question there, and there are a number of books and volumes that have been written on this, but we have to say that however you're going to get to the first conscious person, that person had the ability to choose to do other than what was intended for their life. Now, fortunately, we don't think you're stuck in that situation, that there is redemption that's possible there. But if we think about sin as the ability to do other than what we were supposed to do, that also has consequences for the generations to come. So in the system of forgiveness, a system that has sin, but also a system of forgiveness, if Dan hits me with a car and it breaks my leg, I can forgive him for that. He's actually forgiven, but I still have a broken leg. And so there's complication and there's brokenness that's introduced into the system and into the relationships, even though redemption and forgiveness is still possible within that. So I don't take an Augustinian view of original sin, that it's inherited that way, but I think that by nature of being born into a world, that being born in Chicago, wherever, any city or any place that has brokenness in it, that we will have to deal with the things that are broken by other people. And that doesn't mean that God can't fix it and work in it, but it's a reality of the world that we live in. As it progresses toward what God ultimately has as its final purpose for it, there will always have that tension of having the God-given ability to do something, and then us having the ability to choose whether or not we're going to exercise that ability in keeping with what He has intended for the life of Hunter, or to do it another way. I think I'm going to stop there. Thanks, Hunter. I have a few more thoughts on that, but we better keep moving. Hello.
Hi, too short for this. Okay, hi, I'm Jasmine.
Jackson, hello.
Can you speak to how we can reconcile scientific theories of creation, natural order, the Big Bang theories of primordial soup, that sort of thing, with specifically how we can, like, theory of like the origin story of Genesis, or should we be reading as a literal story, or as a sort of general metaphorical
Okay.
name, just specifically like young Earth creationism and creationism and all these like pseudoscientific theories like intelligent design, just wondering how do they fit together?
Okay, so the question was all the difficult things, how they fit together. Primordial soup, creation, evolution, I think you covered it all pretty much. Thanks, Jessica. So let me say a couple general things, and then you can apply that to whatever specific part of that question you wanted to latch onto. Two things come to mind right off the bat, and there are rarely people who are trained as scientists and theologians, but I happen to know a couple of them that are triple PhD type of guys, and one of them one time said to me that there are 10 different ways that we can interpret Genesis. The other one said to me one time that there are 14 different ways that we can interpret Genesis. So we end up with the differences in the number of different ways in which we can differently interpret Genesis. That's the situation that we're in. We need to live with that reality, that within the Christian world, the Christian framework of thinking, that there are people that have a difference of perspective on this. If you are a Christian and you're trying to reconcile this, or if you're having this conversation with somebody who's not a Christian who thinks you're completely bonkers on this, it's important for you as a Christian to ask yourself, why do I believe anything that's written in Genesis? How in the world could I believe something that was written down before anybody existed? You see, there's a little bit of a problem there, right? So if I am to know anything about reality that happened before people existed, I have to believe in some type of concept of divine revelation, that God could make known to me something that happened before humanity existed. And it also works on the other end. How do we know what happens after we die? Nobody's, well, one person's been there. But on the internet we have those bookings. So a Christian's confidence in Genesis does not come from studying the naturalistic world and then looking at Genesis and saying this matches. A Christian's confidence in Genesis starts actually with our understanding of the possibility of divine revelation, that God can speak into our lives. And so that actually starts with what do we do with Jesus? Because he is the fullness and the essence of God's revelation of himself to humanity. So if we have this concept that God can reveal himself to humanity, then it actually is a warranted belief to think that there are other ways that God can reveal himself to us. If we don't have this concept of Jesus as a revelation from God, then it's very difficult to get to Genesis from that direction. So I'm not saying it's unscientific, I'm saying we have to ask ourselves as Christians having this conversation, why do we believe it's true in the first place? Is because we believe in Revelation. I don't know that many Christians that started in Genesis 1 became Christians. Those people start with Jesus and go back that way. Now the other part of that is to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of Genesis? And so I think there are a number of different good ways to answer that, or to interpret that, and I'm going to give all my thoughts on that right now. But all I have to say is, what is the purpose of what's being said there? And I think all Christians in all systems would agree that what's being said is that God is the one who does the doing, and that he acts alone, and that he is sovereign and powerful over everything that's involved there. And so we start with that, and we also recognize, oddly enough, that Scripture doesn't give us a phenomenal amount of detail about what God was doing there. It also leaves some very interesting questions about the timing. In the beginning, God created. Well, when was that? When was that in relation to the first day? Were there 14 million years in between, or is that exactly sequential? A helpful book on this, quick read, John Lennox, 7 Days That Divide the World. But we have to ask ourselves, what is the point of that? I think it's to set up this idea of God being the creator, the one who's in charge, the one who has a plan for what's going on. And oddly enough, Scripture can give us phenomenal detail when it wants to give us phenomenal detail. We have 47 chapters in the Old Testament that describe how to build the tabernacle and what color the wall side and put on which side facing. When it wants to go into detail, it really does. But in this case in Genesis, it chooses not to give us the full details of that because I don't believe it's supposed to be read like a science manual. We don't learn algebra from numbers or all of our, calculus from Leviticus. I don't know. So without downplaying its importance and its significance at all, and I firmly believe it as it's written, we need to ask ourselves bigger questions, I think, around that, and that helps us start to piece it together of saying, what is the purpose of this? Why is it written this way? And is it meant to be understood scientifically, or does it give us a parameter for how God operates in history and work at it from that angle? So that's ambiguous to your 15 questions, but maybe give some parameter for thinking in that direction. Thank you, Jeff.
Hi, my name is Chris.
Hello,
I'm
Chris.
a retired nurse, an operating room nurse. With all the advancement of technology, I would narrow it down in transplants. Where is God in all of this organ transplants? Because they're starting to replace all the parts of the
Okay.
body.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there. I don't know if you ever heard of. There's a conference that happened recently. Maybe it wasn't recent, but Peter Thiel, billionaire tech guy, and N.T. Wright, who was a theologian out of St. Andrews, had this conference on death and dying and transhumanism. And essentially, it was about 2,000 tech nerds coming in to talk about, how do we understand, in the medical world, this idea of transhuman, this idea of, prolonging life through organ donorship or through even the idea of, putting brains in vats and, preserving and whatnot. It's a fascinating topic. It's extremely fascinating. It's one topic that, I wish I was more educated on. But, one thing I would say, one thing that I did take away from even N.T. Wright's comments was this idea of no matter really where you stand on this position, whether you're a Christian or not, there seems to be in every human being this longing for health, this longing for eternity, perhaps. Maybe that's too much of a spiritual word to say, but this idea to prolong, this idea to continue. Now, when that continuation, when you desire to see that stop, that's where the question becomes a bit more morbid, and that's what the conference was about. But this idea of those who are on the side of, they don't believe in a supernatural, and they therefore want to prolong life. And the Christians saying, well, we're for the advancements of science, but we also recognize that in the human beings there's this desire for eternity. And what if the case was that death wasn't the end? What if it was the case that there was an afterlife where, in the Christian